The discovery began the moment the young researcher stepped into the town, though he didn't recognize it as such at first. He had come armed with dusty notes, half-legible clippings, and the kind of curiosity that made people either admire him or warn him to stop digging before he unearthed something that didn't want to be found. The air felt different as soon as he crossed the county line, as if it thickened in his lungs, the humidity coated with an unspoken dread. He chalked it up to nerves, but the town seemed to exhale when he arrived, as if something buried beneath its soil had sensed a disturbance. The buildings were old enough to sag under their own memories, and the people who lived within them carried the same bowed posture, the same furtive glances that told him they had long ago learned to fear what night could bring. He didn't know yet that every step he took was leading him directly toward a truth that had been carefully sealed away for generations. His first clue was not a document but a silence. When he approached the small local archive, the curator, a man in his 70s with shaking hands and eyes too sharp for his age, froze at the mention of his research topic. The old man stared as though the researcher had spoken a forbidden name, then quietly insisted that no such records existed. But the young man had done his homework. He had traced the disappearances across decades, all pointing back to the same stretch of forest and the same lone woman whose presence had been erased from every surviving official document. The curator's insistence only confirmed that the truth was hidden deliberately. The young researcher noticed little details: how the man locked the door behind him though it was midday, how he kept glancing at the window as if something outside might hear them, and how his voice dropped to a whisper even though the room was empty. Fear lived in this place not as a memory but as an inheritance. Whatever the woman had done, whatever she had become, the town still felt her shadow. The researcher spent the afternoon wandering the outskirts, taking photographs, noting abandoned cabins with doors that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. He found carvings on some of the wood, symbols he couldn't identify, almost as though someone long ago had attempted to warn intruders away. Yet there was a strange pattern to those symbols: they were all facing inward rather than outward, as though meant to trap something inside instead of warding something off. He brushed it off as superstition, but the discovery lingered in his mind like a cold breath. It didn't help that as he moved through the forest edge, he felt the uncanny sensation of being followed. Not by an animal, though the woods were alive with rustling and distant cries, but by something that moved with intelligence, something that didn't fear him but studied him. That night, he stayed in the only motel in town, a narrow building with thin walls and carpets that smelled of damp earth. The woman at the front desk handed him his key without meeting his eyes. When he asked her if she had ever heard of the woman from his research, she tensed so suddenly he could see the pulse in her neck jump. She muttered something about keeping the past buried before retreating into the office and shutting the door. It became clear that the town wasn't merely uninterested in his work, they despised it. They wanted him to leave the past where it had been left. But this resistance only fueled his determination. History didn't hide itself. People hid it. And when people hid something this fiercely, it meant the truth was worth finding. Later, as he reviewed his notes, he noticed a faint outline under the motel room wallpaper, a discolored stain resembling a hand pressed flat against the wall. His mind dismissed it as water damage, but another part of him wondered how a handprint could climb that high unless the person had been standing on something or unless the hand itself had reached far beyond normal height. He tried to sleep, but the motel seemed alive with creaks and faint whispers threading through the vents. He heard what sounded like footsteps pause outside his door, light and deliberate. When he forced himself to look through the peephole, there was nothing but an empty hallway washed in flickering yellow light. Still, the footsteps didn't fade from his memory. They sounded too controlled, too measured, like someone accustomed to stalking rather than walking. In the morning, he returned to the woods with fresh resolve. The forest greeted him not with birdsong but with a heavy, unnatural stillness. Even the wind seemed afraid to disturb the branches. The deeper he walked, the more he sensed a shift in the air, something almost expectant, as if the forest had been waiting for someone to dare enter its heart again. He found an old path half swallowed by vines, a trail that appeared man-made yet abandoned long ago. And near the base of a decaying oak tree, he discovered the first undeniable evidence, a fragment of fabric buried in the roots, impossibly preserved, patterned with a design that matched the clothing described in the oldest accounts of the woman he sought. The moment he touched it, the woods grew colder, and a distant crack echoed between the trees, too deliberate to be nature. It was only then that he understood he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer researching her. He was entering her territory, and whatever had once lived here had never truly left. The archived diaries were not supposed to exist. According to the town, every written trace of her had been destroyed decades earlier, burned in a desperate attempt to cleanse the past and bury the memory of what she had done. But history has a way of clinging to the world, especially the parts no one wants to remember. It was in a storage room beneath the town's abandoned courthouse, its door sealed not with a lock but with a rusted metal cross nailed into the wood, that the researcher found them, a stack of rotting leather-bound journals wrapped in cloth stiffened by time. The air in the room felt unnaturally cold, as though the diaries themselves held the chill of the woman's presence. Dust coated everything except the topmost book, which looked recently disturbed despite the room being untouched. When he reached for it, the cloth gave off the faint smell of mildew and iron, a scent that made his stomach tighten with unease. He opened the first diary delicately, terrified the fragile pages would disintegrate at his touch. The handwriting inside was sharp, angular, every sentence carved into the paper with unsettling force, as if she had written not with ink but with something more permanent. The entries began innocently enough, descriptions of daily chores, the changing seasons, neighbors she disliked, but beneath the mundane words, there was something off, a bitterness coiling through her sentences like a living thing. As he read deeper, the tone shifted. Her language grew colder, more clipped, and her focus zeroed in on a single idea, that the land she lived on was tainted, that certain people had poisoned its purity, that she alone was meant to restore it. Her fixation was not born of sudden madness but of a hatred cultivated over time, shaped by her own isolation and warped beliefs. Line by line, page by page, she recorded the evolution of her delusion, transforming herself from a solitary woman into a self-appointed executioner. The researcher felt a chill run down his spine as he read her words. They were not the ravings of someone detached from reality but the chilling logic of a person who believed entirely in her own justification. The diaries revealed how she began watching people she targeted, learning their routines, navigating the forest with uncanny precision. She wrote of moving without sound, of practicing stillness until even the animals no longer sensed her presence. She described the forest as her partner, a living entity that obeyed her, concealed her, protected her. She wrote of the moon as her guide and of silence as her weapon. The more he read, the more he realized he was not looking at simple hate but something deeper, something ritualistic. Her cruelty had fused with her environment until the line between woman and wilderness blurred. The most disturbing passages were those where she described transformation, not physical but spiritual, as though she believed she had become something more than human. She wrote of how the forest accepted her after her first act of violence, how the darkness opened itself to her, teaching her to disappear into it. She claimed she no longer needed lanterns because the night itself showed her the way. And then, in an entry dated months after her disappearance from official records, she wrote a line that made the researcher close the book in instinctive fear: "I am becoming what the land needs me to be. It speaks through me now." The handwriting in that sentence slanted wildly, carving into the paper so deeply it nearly tore through. He forced himself to keep reading. Some diaries were partially ruined, whole chunks lost to mold or chewed away by insects, but enough remained for him to piece together a portrait of a mind deteriorating into something predatory. She described hearing whispers in the wind, voices calling her deeper into the trees. She believed the land demanded she hunt, that every life she took restored balance to a world she thought had fallen into corruption. It was a twisted theology of her own invention, growing more elaborate with each violent act. The diaries stopped mentioning time, seasons, or years, suggesting she had abandoned any sense of chronology. She noted only phases of the moon, the movements of shadows, and the patterns of footsteps she heard outside her cabin at night, footsteps she insisted were not human. One entry chilled him more than all the others combined. She wrote of watching a man from the edge of the woods for 3 nights. She described how his breathing sounded, how his fear tasted in the air, how the forest seemed to lean in around her, waiting for her to act. And then she wrote something he couldn't explain. He saw me, but I did not exist to him until I chose to. It was the kind of sentence that should have sounded symbolic, but it didn't. It felt literal, as though she had discovered a way to slip in and out of a person's awareness. As though she had learned to erase herself until the exact second she struck. By the time the researcher reached the final surviving diary, his hands had begun trembling. This book was different. The handwriting was barely legible, the ink smeared, the entries short and frantic. She wrote of losing her body, of slipping into the trees, of becoming part of the breath between branches. She described her reflection disappearing from the creek water, her footsteps no longer leaving prints, her heartbeat slowing until she could barely feel it. The last entry ended abruptly with a single unfinished sentence: "The forest is calling me home and I am ready to." He sat there in the dim basement, the diaries spread around him like relics of a forgotten ritual, and felt the weight of the truth settle over him. She had not simply been a murderer shaped by hatred. She had become something else entirely, something the forest embraced and concealed. And now that he had read her words, he understood why the town wished her memory erased. They were not afraid of who she had been. They were afraid of what she had become and of the possibility that she was not gone but waiting. The first sighting came 2 days after he finished reading the diaries, though at the time he dismissed it as exhaustion, the natural hallucinations that creep in when someone immerses themselves too deeply in a horror not meant for living minds. He had been sitting on the motel balcony late at night, the woods stretched out in a dark mass beyond the parking lot, when he noticed a shape among the trees, a pale sliver, unmoving, positioned exactly where the forest swallowed the last street lamp's light. It could have been a trick of shadow, a slanted trunk, a scrap of mist caught between branches. But the shape didn't sway with the wind. It didn't shift when the shadows shifted. It stayed perfectly still, like something waiting. He stared for so long his eyes watered, and when he finally blinked, the shape was gone. He told himself it had never been there to begin with. But he didn't sleep that night, and when he went outside the next morning, he found footprints in the dew leading from the tree line toward the motel, then stopping in the middle of the asphalt as if the figure had simply dissolved into the air. By noon, the town was already humming with quiet rumors. People gathered in small knots outside the diner, whispering, their eyes darting toward the woods with the same fearful recognition. A woman at the counter muttered that the signs were back, though she wouldn't answer when he asked what signs she meant. An elderly man who had refused to meet his gaze days earlier now grabbed his wrist with a trembling hand and warned him to leave while he still could. There was no explanation, no mention of the woman, but their fear had grown sharper, more focused. Something had shifted. Something had reawakened. The researcher felt it too, an invisible pressure at the edge of his senses, like the air itself was turning its attention toward him. As he walked through town, he noticed other changes. Stray dogs that usually lounged in the shade were now pacing restlessly, ears flattened. Birds avoided the treetops closest to the forest. Even the insects seemed quieter, their usual chatter replaced by a thick silence that clung to the ground. When he passed the sheriff's office, he saw that the windows had been boarded from the inside, as though someone believed the threat would come not from within the town but from the darkness beyond it. No one wanted to speak, but their actions told him everything. This was not a new fear. It was a returning one. That evening, driven by equal parts dread and curiosity, he walked toward the woods again, stopping at the same point where he had seen the pale shape. The air felt colder here, unnaturally so, as if the shade beneath the trees harbored a different season altogether. He stepped carefully, half hoping to find evidence, half praying he wouldn't. That was when he noticed the tree bark, deep scratches carved in long vertical streaks, too high for any animal in the area to have made. The grooves were fresh. Splinters of bark still clung to the edges, and when he touched them, he felt warmth, as if whatever had made them had done so only minutes earlier. His heart thudded painfully, and he forced himself to turn back, but not before hearing something faint yet unmistakable, a soft exhale drifting through the trees, close enough that he should have felt breath on his skin. The second sighting came from someone else, a farmer whose land bordered the forest's northern edge. The researcher found him sitting on his porch at sunrise, hands wrapped around a mug he wasn't drinking from, staring at the tree line as though it had spoken his name in the dark. When asked what he'd seen, the farmer hesitated, then described a figure standing between his barn and the woods just before dawn, a tall woman with hair hanging in tangled sheets down her back, her face obscured by shadow though the rising light should have illuminated her features. He said she didn't move when he shouted. She didn't react at all. She simply watched him. And when he took a step forward, she dissolved, not into the trees but into the air itself, fading like smoke in reverse. He swore the temperature dropped so sharply that frost formed on the grass in a perfect circle where she had stood. The researcher felt a sickening familiarity tighten in his chest. The diaries had described this exact phenomenon, her ability to appear only when she wished to be perceived, her uncanny stillness, the sudden cold that followed her. He tried to ground himself in logic, in rational explanations, tricks of light, shared hysteria, the town's buried trauma resurfacing in the form of hallucinations. But the facts did not align neatly, and deep down he knew it. Something was wrong with the land itself, as if her presence lingered not as a memory but as a residue that could take shape whenever disturbed. The third sighting came at night, and this time there was no room for doubt. He awoke to the sound of tapping on his motel window, rhythmic and deliberate. His pulse hammered as he approached it, every instinct urging him to stay back. But he forced himself to look. Outside, only inches from the glass, stood the faint outline of a woman's silhouette, impossibly tall, her head tilted slightly as though studying him. The parking lot behind her was empty, yet she cast no shadow. Her hair floated around her shoulders despite the windless air, and her face, if she had one, remained hidden in a void of darkness. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, her hand lifted, fingers long and thin, and pressed against the glass. Frost spread outward from her touch, crystallizing across the windowpane in branching patterns that resembled both ice and veins. He staggered back, heart in his throat, and when he blinked, she was gone. No footprints. No condensation. Only the ice patterns remained, glowing faintly in the moonlight like a message he couldn't decipher. But he understood one thing with absolute certainty. The sightings weren't coincidences or hallucinations. They were warnings. The diaries had not just recounted her transformation, they had foretold her return. And now that someone had dared to reopen her story, she had stirred from whatever darkness held her, drawn once more to the world she believed she was meant to cleanse, moving closer each night, learning him the way she once learned all her chosen prey. Her patience sharpening with every passing breath. The survivor did not come forward out of trust or courage, but out of the kind of terror that burrows so deeply into a person's bones that hiding from it becomes impossible. The researcher met him by accident, or perhaps fate, when he stopped at the gas station on the edge of town to buy batteries for his recorder. The attendant told him quietly that someone had been asking about him, someone who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The researcher followed the attendant's gaze to the far corner of the lot, where an old man sat hunched on a bench, his shoulders drawn inward as if he were trying to fold himself into disappearance. His eyes were fixed on the woods across the road, not blinking, not moving, as though he feared that if he looked away for even a moment, something would step out of the tree line and claim him. The researcher approached cautiously, sensing a fragility in the man that went beyond age, something wounded and desperate. The old man flinched at the sound of footsteps, then studied the researcher with eyes that seemed to look through him rather than at him. There was a moment of silence before he spoke, his voice rough and thin, like paper scraping against stone. He asked whether the researcher had read the diaries. When the answer came, the man nodded slowly, as if he had expected nothing less, as if the diaries had been waiting for someone new to open them. The survivor introduced himself only as Thomas, refusing to share his last name, saying it had been taken from him long ago by the woman in the woods. The words sent a chill through the researcher, who realized this was not simply someone aware of the stories, this was someone who had lived inside them. Thomas began to talk, not with the hesitance of someone choosing what to reveal, but with the urgency of someone who feared he might not have another chance. He said he had been 10 years old when she came for him, a small child living with his parents in a cabin near the forest's edge. Even then, long before she vanished from history, people in the town whispered warnings: stay indoors after sunset, never go into the woods alone, and never, under any circumstances, answer if you heard a woman call your name from between the trees. Children weren't told why. They were expected to obey. And Thomas had obeyed until the night he forgot a toy outside and slipped out after dark to retrieve it. He said he felt her presence before he saw her, a coldness pushing against the back of his neck, a pressure like hands hovering just inches from his skin. He described her not as a person but as a silhouette more perfect than any shadow should be, a shape that seemed carved out of the dark itself. She moved without sound, gliding rather than stepping, her face hidden behind a curtain of hair that never fully revealed what lay beneath. Even decades later, Thomas trembled as he spoke, his fingers twitching unconsciously as if they remembered reaching for the door that night, the frantic scramble to escape. He said she didn't chase him with the frantic speed of a predator but with a calm patience, as though she knew she would eventually catch him. Her certainty had been more terrifying than her presence, a quiet confidence that made his heart freeze even as his legs carried him forward. He only survived because of his father, a man larger in memory than he had ever been in life. Thomas said his father burst from the cabin with a lantern held high, shouting words Thomas couldn't remember, words that came from fear rather than knowledge. The woman paused in the light, her silhouette flickering as though the lantern interrupted whatever strange existence she occupied. Thomas swore her head tilted in an unnatural angle, studying his father with something close to amusement. And then she vanished, not stepped back or turned away but literally vanished, dissolving into the dark as if night had swallowed her whole. His father didn't speak of it afterward. He didn't explain what he had seen. Instead, the next day he boarded up the windows, nailed charms above the doors, and demanded they move closer to town. They left the cabin within a week, never returning. The silence that followed became its own kind of marker, a reminder that some truths were too heavy for words. As Thomas recounted this, his voice cracked under the strain of memory. He said the woman didn't just disappear from the forest after that night. She disappeared from the town's collective life. People stopped mentioning her. Stories were erased. Documents were burned. It was as if the entire community agreed to bury her existence under layers of silence, fearing that speaking of her would give her form again. But Thomas insisted she hadn't died. He claimed no one ever found a body because she hadn't needed one anymore. She had become part of the woods, a breath in the darkness, a presence hiding between every rustle and every shadow. He said he felt her watching him over the years, in the creak of floorboards, in the unnatural chill during summer nights, in the rare moments he glanced into the trees and thought he saw movement shifting just beyond sight. When the researcher pressed him for more, Thomas leaned forward, gripping his arm so tightly it hurt. He whispered that the sightings around town were not new manifestations, they were signs she had awakened because someone had disturbed the diaries. The town had kept them buried for a reason. Reading them was a summons, a call she had been waiting to hear. Thomas said she always returned to those who sought her story, that curiosity fed her, that attention revived her. His voice shook as he warned the researcher that he had already been marked, that she now knew him, understood his footsteps, his breath, the rhythm of his fear. He said she never forgot those who looked for her and never forgave those who uncovered what the town tried to erase. And as he spoke those final words, Thomas's gaze drifted past the researcher to the tree line across the road. His face drained of color. His breath stopped. He whispered that she was listening, that she had found them again, and that night would no longer keep her contained. The decision to stop her was not born out of bravery but out of the growing realization that survival was no longer possible without confrontation. The researcher had spent days watching the town deteriorate under the weight of something unseen yet undeniably present. Doors were barricaded, windows covered with blankets instead of curtains, families whispering prayers in hallways lit only by candlelight. The forest, once a static backdrop, now felt like a living thing pressing inward, its branches curling like fingers toward the streets. Even the sky seemed dimmer, as though the daylight no longer wished to touch a place claimed by her shadow. Each night, the sightings grew closer, the cold deeper, and the silence heavier, as if the air itself were preparing for some final act. The researcher realized that if he continued running, she would follow, and if the town continued hiding, she would eventually step through their doors. Fear was no longer a shield. It was bait. He began searching for something he wasn't entirely sure existed, a way to anchor her, weaken her, bind her, anything that resembled a method of opposition. Logic no longer helped him. The diaries, the sightings, the survivors' warnings all pointed to a truth that defied explanation. The answer, he suspected, lay not in the town's written history but in what they had attempted to erase. He returned to the basement beneath the courthouse, the air colder than before, as though she knew he had come back. Among the diaries he had not yet touched, he found a single notebook separate from the others, wrapped in a different cloth, the fabric darker, stiff like something that had dried in it long ago. The writing inside was not hers. It belonged to someone else, an early sheriff of the town, judging from the signature. The entries were short, frantic, and terrified. They described failed attempts to trap her, to banish her, to end her hold on the woods. Each attempt ended the same way, silence, followed by more disappearances. The researcher stayed up all night reading, illuminated by a lantern that flickered nervously, as though afraid to burn too brightly. The sheriff wrote of rituals attempted by desperate families, old charms hammered into trees, circles drawn with trembling hands, invocations whispered at the borders of the forest. None of them worked. But buried near the end of the notebook was something different, a technique not based on ancient superstition but on understanding the woman herself. The sheriff believed her transformation had tied her essence to memory and recognition, that her power strengthened when people feared her, spoke of her, acknowledged her. The more she became mythic, the more she became real. The sheriff's final theory suggested that she could be weakened only by confronting the truth she had tried to escape, the humanity she abandoned. If someone could force her to face a piece of her former self, a possession, a memory, something she had written, her form might falter, if only briefly. The researcher clung to that possibility. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't protection. It was a sliver of hope carved from desperation. He gathered the materials he believed he would need: the diaries, lanterns, heavy cloth, and, at the urging of Thomas, a piece of iron shaped like a ring, said to disrupt whatever unnatural presence she had become. Thomas wanted to accompany him but was too weakened by years of fear and by the resurgence of her presence. Instead, he gave the researcher directions to a cabin deep in the forest, a place where she once lived, where she had taken her first step into the darkness that reshaped her. Thomas said she would be drawn there, that returning to the origin of her transformation would pull her from the shadows she now used as shelter. The researcher entered the forest as dusk bled into night, each step carrying the weight of a decision he wished someone else could make. The woods welcomed him with their unnatural cold, a hush settling over the leaves as though they recognized him. The deeper he went, the more the air pressed in around him. Shadows shifted at the edges of his vision. Branches trembled without wind. The path turned winding and narrow, yet he felt guided, pushed toward an inevitable confrontation. When he finally reached the cabin, its roof caved in, its walls rotting, he felt an unmistakable shift. The darkness gathered in a single place, coalescing like breath-forming frost on winter air. He placed the diaries on the ground and opened the one containing her earliest entries. He read aloud, his voice unsteady but determined. The words trembled in the air, echoing faintly as if the forest repeated them. The temperature plummeted. The trees groaned. And then he felt it, the familiar sensation of being watched by something standing just at the edge of sight. He didn't turn. Turning would only make her retreat. Instead, he continued reading, flipping through memories she had tried to bury. Pages that described her childhood. Lines that revealed her insecurities. Sentences filled with envy, bitterness, fear. He recited them like incantations not meant to summon but to unravel. The air thinned as her presence solidified behind him, the cold spreading like fingers along his spine. He felt her lean closer, the way her attention tightened, the way her shape flickered in the corner of his eye. And when he read the line that had marked the beginning of her transformation, "I am becoming what the land needs me to be," the forest shuddered violently. Her form wavered, flickering like a dying flame. For a moment, he believed it was working. For a moment, he believed he had found a way to weaken her. Then she moved. Not with rage, not with urgency, but with the same slow, deliberate grace that had followed him for days. Her hand, impossibly cold, touched his shoulder, and in that instant he understood the sheriff's final unspoken truth. Forcing her to confront her past would not destroy her. It would only awaken the part of her that remembered what she once was and what she believed she was destined to become.